Catus Maximus here. Figured I'd do a review of this Vise because it is my favorite Vise and my one big Vise. And to kind of bring attention to this brand, Sambre and Meuse, M-E-U-S-E. Now there's a French company, Dolex, which I believe has kind of restored their name, and they actually are making Vises again. But as far as I understand, this was a French company that had, or it's kind of hard to find the information. There's some relations that may have been founded in Belgium and then moved their foundry to France. I'm not exactly sure, but this was a premium grade French Vise. And they're actually pretty rare to find over in the United States. I kind of got this on a deal for $50, surprisingly enough. Most Vises used, people want an arm and a leg for. And the person who's selling this, and as far as I knew, thought it was really a Chinese Vise. Because you just couldn't find any casting information or anything on it. So you assumed, if it was a nice Wilton or Colombian, or I think it's called a Rock River Vise, which are people are real familiar with in America. A Sambre is not. Now, obviously, with tools, there's a whole world of Vises out there. I actually found, trying to research on this, I ran into a German company that actually makes forged body Vises, but they are incredibly expensive. This Vise is a 6x8, so 6-inch wide jaws by 8 inches of what would be considered nominal or appropriate travel, 8 inches while still having at least a ½ inch of beam sticking out for full strength. This same size of Vise from that forged German company was $1,700. It was real surprising. And a Vise like this today from Wilton or somebody like that's going to set you back quite a bit. It is a heavy Vise. This thing, I believe, weighs over 50 pounds. It's hugely heavy. And I know I have it actually bolted to a block of wood rather than a workbench. I'm in a situation where I don't have space for a big workbench. And many times I'm doing stuff like trying to get stubborn bushings out of automotive control arms and all sorts of projects like that. So it's actually easier for it to be on the ground, a lot more ergonomic, so I can get more direct access and force to whatever I'm trying to deal with. I did buy it used, and it had been plenty used and beaten. Actually, most of the damage on this Vise is from the previous owner, but it kind of goes to show you that if you have a nice quality Vise, that this is what they will deal with. You're supposed to be nicer to your Vises, but the real purpose of them is to hold stuff so that you can work on them. And if they get beat up, so be it. A poor quality Vise just won't really handle being used outside of its optimal operating conditions, and a high quality one like the Sambre, which has just been beaten by its previous owner, still works great. The jaws still close in parallel. The lead screw is still straight and in good condition. One property of nice quality Vises is replaceable jaws, and of course this has that property where you have your cast iron, and then you have some hardened alloy steel jaws, which take a lot of the abuse, and once they really get beat up, the idea is that you can get them replaced. And the nice thing about Vise jaws is they're literally straight pieces of metal with knurling on the inside and a couple of countersunk holes. So even a local machine shop, for not an unreasonable amount of money, should be able to make a couple straight pieces of metal with texturing on one side and a couple holes drilled into it. It's even something that you could do at home. Surprisingly enough, you can get, say 4140 chromoly steel stock. Just use a drill press or even a hand drill, to tell you the truth, to drill the holes and countersink them. And then you can use a torch just to heat them up to, and there's actually, if you have good color vision, then there are excellent color temperature charts. And certain things like on Samsung phones where they have the organic LED screens really have good color. And so you can actually use one of those color charts, different shades of orange, to get a pretty good idea of how hot the metal is. And 4140, you will want to right around 1500 degrees. And then quench them in some oil. And you can harden your own jaws at home too. It's one of the nice things about Vises is that they are real simple and simple to repair. How I knew this is a Sambre is once I got it, they actually cast their name on the inside of the beam. This is a horseshoe-shaped beam, as you can see there. And on the inside of the casting here, it actually says Sambre. There's also this letter A. Let me get a light up there so you can see. So if you see a Vise that right at the back end, it has like a letter A, And then right at the tongue up there where the light's shining, looks like a letter D. That would be your first indications that maybe it is a vise that you should take a closer look at. And that's how I ended up with this one. Sambre vices, from what I've read, are really just as good as any Colombian or any other vice brand, but playing off of ignorance, even my own ignorance. So if you're looking at vices and you see some old funky vice, it could actually be quite a nice one. Especially since Sambres were so rare in America, it's kind of, it makes me curious on how this one ended up over here. Because as far as my understanding, they stopped making these or shipping them over in the 70s. This vise did include a swivel vase, but I don't normally use, actually I've never used the swivel vase on the vices. The swivel bases are actually just a ring that the outer edge of the round base of vices, and that's not just this vise, but most vices sit on. And then there's some U-shaped channels, has a wide inner flange, some U-shaped channels, and then that's where the little handles go into that tighten against the nut, so you can swivel the vise back and forth. Well, oftentimes I actually am using vices to pound stuff out, and having a vise sitting on a ring, I've seen those adjustable bases break apart under heavy-duty use because you're supporting the whole vise on just a ring, which is kind of surprising. Well, I also understand making a big, thick cast swivel base would make a 50-pound vise a 70-pound vise, and it just starts getting ridiculous. One nice feature of any vices, and is included on this Sambre, is the tongue. The tongue is that you have the body of the vise where the fixed jaw is, and then the tongue provides some additional support for the beam when you have it out, particularly when it's well extended. And of course, on the swivel base, that tongue is cantilevered out and actually means more, but it's nice, even when it's flat, that the whole bottom of the vise and the tongue are all machined at the same level. So when you bolt it to a flat surface, you get a real solid vise with the base held across its whole surface as well as the tongue. It really makes them much more rigid. But that tongue really is a hallmark of high quality vices, something that provide additional support for the beam. Let me get this opened up some. This does have another feature which I have not really been able to figure out yet, and I'm hoping maybe a commenter will be. But inside the lead screw, there's like a pretty large snap ring. That's what keeps the screw in attaches it to the movable jaw when you're opening it. But they have a very heavy duty. It's like a flat wire spring and incredibly heavy duty, like a really oversized valve spring. And so this vise is old, and so in its closed position, it gets a little stuck, but it's odd that there's a spring in there, and you can see as I unscrew it, it will pop open because of that spring tension, and then the rest of the time that I use it, it doesn't have that issue. It's only when it's fully clamped tight. Now, one thing I believe it is there for is when something is clamped tight, it gives you that exact property where you unscrew the handle a little bit and then it shoots open just a small gap, and it makes it easy to get your parts in and out of. And I think maybe that's why it was there, but I'm not entirely sure. Another thing I was going to mention about quality vices is that the handles, the material, the grade of steel that they're made out of, and their length is actually balanced for the vise, i.e., most people don't know Jacob's chucks, but keyed Jacob's chucks, the metal that the key handle is made out of, is designed to bend before you apply so much force or risking stripping the threads in the Jacob's chuck. It's actually surprising. Vices are the same way, that the handles are designed to start bending before you get to a point of actually stripping the threads, or more importantly, breaking the internal nut that takes all the force of all the clamping force. Now, if I open this up some, as I get this opened up, I did want to mention that the beam, which is an indicator of how strong a vise is, and obviously the wider the jaws and the longer, or the further the travel, the bigger the beam. And this is 2 3/4 inches by 2 3/4 inches, 2 3/4 inches across the top by its height. What's interesting is, even though it's from overseas, you expect these dimensions to be metric, it actually comes out just about right to the dot of 2 3/4 inches. So it is a pretty large dimension beam. Another feature of many vices is having the ability to hold round stock, such as in this Sambre, what we have. Let me move it. This thing is ridiculously heavy. There we go. We can see that it has these big blocks in here. Let me see if I can't zoom in some. There we go. we can see that it has, here, let me move this. Here we go. Now you can see that a lot better. We have blocks in here to hold round stock. Now many vices, even Colombians, Wiltons, etc., this portion that holds the round stock, first, that's a feature. Really cheap Colombians and Wiltons and other vices won't have any provision for holding round stock. Slightly nicer ones will have cast-in provisions. I've seen actually real expensive multi-$100 Wiltons where it's still a cast block or part of the cast frame for holding round stock. And one disadvantage is it's not going to be as hard or as durable a steel as actually what the Vise jaws are. And two, it actually impedes your ability to do work on the Vise. How I mean is this space, you can see that the jaws actually cantilever out from the front face by about 1.5 inches. And that gives you a lot of times where you have some kind of object where you need to grab in the middle and you have a wider area, it gives it space to sit out in. Obviously with vices with cast-in round stock holders, you just don't have that option. It kind of hinders, and there's been a couple situations where I've been prying bearings off and need to put something in here and have like the gear sit in the open space while I use 2 pry bars against the tops of these jaws to pry off the bearing, and it's actually a great way to pull bearings. Real safe. You can put a couple pieces of wood. I was able to, and it just worked out great. But the reason that worked out great is in the Sambre, these blocks are held in by large cap screws. So it gives you 2 options. One, we can see in these blocks, they actually have 3 different sizes, a very large, a medium, and a small slots for round stock holding, which is a big deal that they included multiple sizes. I think that's great. Secondly, they can be flipped upside down, so if you want to use the smaller holders up high or use the large holder down low, you have that option. The fourth deal is that these are independent blocks of steel and are actually heat-treated steel like the jaws, so these hold up much better. Fourth, you can remove them and gain that space that you need inside the vise to do things like pulling gears and, of course, put them back in. A fifth great aspect of these is like on the Sambre, they're actually designed where the faces of these are even with the vise jaw. So if you put in just like a giant block of wood or something else that's large and flat, it won't only just grip with the jaws, it'll grip with these portions of the round stock holder blocks that are down in the bottom of the vise. And so it actually provides you really large extra gripping power of any larger flat objects, and it's been great. And once I kind of noticed how something as simple as having removable round stock blocks actually means quite a bit, because there's so many different aspects of what something that seems so simple has a lot of significant properties and effects on a vise. So I'd always recommend that, and any vise that puts together the effort to have removable and reversible round stock blocks, you know is going to be more than just a basic Chinese unit. Let me zoom back out here. I'm going to open this up all the way. This is ridiculously heavy, just to demonstrate the capacity. Here we are again. We can see the size of my hand. This is a 203 millimeter or 8-inch bicycle disc brake rotor. And as you can see, having a vise which has a great deal of capacity means that you can do a lot more projects using it as a press. I mean, just all sorts of things that you'd be surprised. Most vices are smaller, 3 or 4 inch wide jaws. They usually open about 4 inches, maybe a nice one is 6 inches. But the big deal is having all the capacity, getting a vise with as much capacity as you can really afford. And this has been great for automotive use, because having all this capacity really allows you to get suspension parts and hub assemblies and all sorts of industrial uses. Just gives you a lot of options and abilities. Let me get that out of there. Now, what is also nice is that this would be the rated capacity where there's still beam, about 1/2 inch of beam sticking past the back of the vise. That would be maintaining quote-unquote full strength. However, with where it has an extended screw and the nuts actually set in a little bit closer to the front, right about where the bolt is, so you can actually stretch this open to 10 inches if you really need to, and the threads will be right at the, flush with the nut inside. But it's still usable. You're aware that the beam is now, halfway inside the base of the vise, so you can't do heavy hammering. But it gives you the ability to have another 1.5 inches or 2 inches of capacity if you really need it in certain types of situations. Anyway, that's about what I have for the review of the Sambre vise. I just wanted to bring attention to it because there's just so little information on these Sambre vises. Even searching through Google, it's just a few forums that you run into where people talk about these. So here's a YouTube video about one to really show people a little closer look and what really made Sambres nice. And just to compare, this is one of these Japanese kind of cast steel mini bench vices, clamp-on style. These are actually pretty nice. These were the premium grade. I forget who makes these, but as a comparison, this would be considered closer to a more, not normal size. This is a compact vise, but you know, the round stock portion is, of course, cast into it. But we can see just how large a 6x8 vise is when you can take a pretty, a well-known clamp-on or portable vise and just put the whole thing into this one. And to finish this off, yes, this style of vise, the ones that were made in Japan, there's a lot of Chinese knockoffs. The Japanese ones were the high-quality ones because they had the really nice, well-ground jaws on them. These are the best type of mini vise that you can clamp onto an edge of a table or something like that and just use for small, basic projects. So I wanted to point that out as well since I brought this out in the video. If you see one of these little vices and they're decent shape and they're made in Japan, you will want to pick it up because these are some of the very best of just the mini vices. And it's surprising, as much as you need a large vise, this vise starts becoming quite unwieldy when you just want to work on smaller, simpler stuff. Anyway, that's the end of another review and kind of overview of this Sambre and Meuse. I don't know how to pronounce French, but I don't need to know how to pronounce it to understand that the Sambre vices were good vices, and to bring that to you guys. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. Catus Maximus out.